Hello, I'm Mr. Wilson, and this is episode 4 in the video series Ethical Hacking. In the first video, we learned about what ethical hacking is. In the second video, we learned about server-side scripting and how it can be used to obscure some of our code from the prying eyes of the client computer. And in episode 3, we started learning about SQL databases and how we can use a database to store sensitive information like usernames and passwords. We also created a web page that allows users to self-register new accounts. So they create their own username and password, they hit the submit button, and our page will add their username and password to the database for us to save our programmers the trouble of having to enter that information in manually. It also prevents our programmers from having access to sensitive information. In this episode, we'll be updating our login page to utilize the database as well. You may recall in the second episode that we had hard-coded username and password information directly into the login handler. That's not the proper way to do things. We now want to utilize our database. Once we have the login and registration pages finalized, we'll be able to do some code injection to actually hack our database. Then we'll learn about the proper way to insulate our code from things like code injection. Let's get started. Okay, here we are in our file manager, and we can see that in the last episode we had created a registration page and a registration handler. In the first and second videos, we created a login page, that's our index PHP file here, and a handler to handle the login as well. Let's go ahead and open the handler just to re-familiarize ourselves with the way this works. When you first log into the page, you'll notice that we are retrieving the username and password information that the user types into the boxes and comparing them against hard-coded values. Was the username equal to Mike? Was the password equal to 1234? If so, we display a welcome message. So our first order of business today is to remove the hard-coded values and utilize the database instead. Now, in the previous episode, we learned that whenever we access the database, we have to first log into the database. And we can see that happening in the registration handler page. Let's go ahead and open that to refamiliarize ourselves there. Here you can see there is login information that will log us into the database itself, and then this line of code actually makes the connection to the database. So recall that these username and password information here is not what the user, our client, types in the username and password box. This is the username and password for the database itself. It's written here in PHP because PHP is a server-side scripting language, and therefore this connection information will be invisible to our end user. So we do need this login information whenever we connect to the database. So our first order of business here is to go ahead and copy this stuff, and I'm going to go paste it into the handler for our login page. So I'm going to come into our handler, and I'm going to paste that right up at the top. Now, one of the things that I did notice here is that in our login page, we used the name uname, but our password was called pass. In the registration page, we called it pword instead. So just for consistency, I'm going to change that here. I always like all of my stuff to remain consistent across all of my pages. It makes it less likely for me to make typos. So here I've got the connection information to log into the database itself, and I can retrieve the username and pword from the text boxes that the user types in. We're going to go ahead and save this because we do need to make a change to the login page as well so that it also says pword. So I'm going to go over to our login page, and I'm going to change the one that says pass. It's going to become pword. And we'll go ahead and change it here too, just for consistency, so everything is the same. The name is the one that's the most important because it is the name that gets sent to the PHP handler when we hit the submit button. So now that that has been changed to pword, we can go ahead and save, and everything is consistent. This says handler, whereas this is the registration handler. Just for clarification, since we are starting to get several pages in our document here, I'm going to go ahead and rename the handler to be login handler to differentiate it from the registration handler. If I right click on this, I have a rename option right here, and I'm going to call it login handler. Now, if I do change the name of the handler page, that means the index file also has to point to the new name as well. So one more time, we're going to open up our index page, and we're going to change the action. Instead of going to handler, it's now going to go to login handler. All right, so this is just a little bit of housekeeping stuff. We're just kind of getting everything all normalized. We're ready to start adding some new code. So let's go into the login handler and we'll start editing our code in here. We have already copied and pasted the connection code to get us a connection to the database. Now we're going to check that connection just like we did before to verify that it's connected properly. This if statement here that contains our hard-coded usernames and passwords, we're going to be removing that, but I'm just going to push it down for right now to get it out of the way, give myself some room to type. So here I'm going to say if con. So this is going to check to see if our connection was successfully made to the database. If it was, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to check the username and password. So here we know that the post array contains something called uname. I'm going to copy and paste that. And the post array should contain something called pword as well. I'm going to copy and paste that. I'm going to store those inside a couple of variables just to make it a little bit easier for me to access so I don't have to type that whole post thing every time. I'll create a variable called pword here just to save me a little bit of time. And of course, semicolons at the end of each one of those lines. So now this variable, uname, now contains the information that was in the post array at the uname index. Same thing here. This variable called pword contains whatever the password is that the user typed in the box. Now that we're done with that, we can actually remove this stuff here. I'm going to leave the header for right now because we're going to move that and reuse it a little bit later. But for right now, it's in the wrong place and does the wrong thing. So I'm just going to push it down to get it out of my way, and we're going to start building our SQL command. All right, so I'm going to create a variable here called SQL Command, and it's going to equal, and I'm going to start typing out that command. And it's going to look like this. Select everything from our table. So we have to access, what we're trying to do is we're trying to access all the records in the database that contain both this username and this password. So to develop a SQL command, if you're just learning SQL for the first time, there's a place where you can kind of practice this, and let me show you how to do that. If we go into our PHP My Admin page, and if we open up our database, and then we go into our users table, under the Browse tab for our users table, we can see all of the users that are in here. If you want to play with the SQL, you can actually use the SQL tab here. And sometimes I like to do this. I like to build an SQL command first that works, and then I'll just copy and paste it into my code. So to show you what I mean, just for example's sake, here you can see that to select all of the records in the entire database, it just says select asterisk means everything. Select everything from the users table. And that's essentially what we're doing here in our code. Select everything from, and then we say the users table. Now you do have to spell this correctly. So here you can see users is spelled with a capital U. So I need to make sure that I spell it with a capital U here as well. Select everything from the users table. Now, this is not quite what I want. I don't want to select all the users. What I want to do is select the user that has just this username and just this password. So it's going to return exactly one record, not all of them. So to do this, I can either go to the SQL tab here, or I can edit the SQL statement that the computer has already built for me. See, there's a little edit button right here. Actually edit in line. I can just go ahead and click on that and change this. So select everything from the users table where, and I'm going to specify my criteria here, where the username, you can see this little helper box is helping me out, where username equals, and then in single quotation marks, I'm going to type in what username I'm looking for. In this case, Mike. And password equals, and in single quotation marks, I'm going to type in ABC123. And then a semicolon to finish that off. Okay, so now that I've written my line of code, I want to test it and see if this actually works. So I'm going to hit the Go button. It's going to query the database, and it will either give me an error or it will return a result. In this case, it says that it is showing one total record. There is one record in my database that has the combination of this username and this password, and that's what we're looking for. If our username and password returns one result, then we know that we have we've entered a valid username and password. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this command. I'm going to highlight and copy this, and I'm going to go paste it into our code here. So here I started building it. I'm just going to copy and paste that, and just make sure that it's still in the quotation marks. Select everything from the users table. I'm going to go ahead and remove these. You can see that these single quotation marks are different than these single quotation marks, and sometimes I've noticed that this jams up my code. So I'm going to remove those little single quotes. Since the name of my table is just one word, I don't actually need them at all. So select everything from the users where username equals Mike and password equals ABC123. Now, of course, we have to put a semicolon at the end of our SQL statement, and because this is part of a PHP line of code, that one also needs a semicolon, so I'm going to put that in also. Now, if you'll notice, we have once again hard-coded our username and password, which is not what we want to do. We want to use the username and password that they supplied to us in those little text boxes on the login page. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out the hard-coded username, and I'm going to use my uname variable that I created. I'm going to take out the hard-coded password and instead use the p-word variable that I created. All right, so now whatever they type into the box, that's what will get substituted into my SQL statement. All right, so I'm going to select all of that. All right, before we get too carried away, I always like to make sure I hit the save button because this thing does like to log me out randomly, and it doesn't tell me when it logs me out, and I don't want to lose my code, so make sure you save frequently. Now that we have built an SQL command, we have to tell the computer to actually run that command, and we did that one other time in our registration page. Just to refresh your memory, it looks like this. All right, so here you can see we're using this function. All we have to do is pass it two parameters. Tell it what connection to the database you have and what SQL command you want to run. It will run the command, and whatever result it generates will get stored into this variable. In this case, we know that this command is going to return one record, the one record that we saw here, one user. And it will store that user's information, that entire record, in this variable. So now what we're going to do is we're going to put in a little if statement that said, hey, did you successfully return a result? Here's what I mean by that. Let me go back. I'm going to edit this. And what if I typed in the wrong password? What if I said 1234? Okay, this is the wrong password. Let's see what happens if I type in the wrong password information. Let's run this SQL command. And you can see that this has returned an empty result set, 0 rows. Notice that there are no usernames, no records that correspond to the username and password that I've typed in. That's what we're looking for. We want to know if one record was returned. So what we can do is we can type in an if statement and we can say, hey, what was the result? We could say if the result was false. In other words, if the SQL command generated an error, it didn't run properly at all. So if that happens, or if it returns 0 rows. All right, so what this is a function that's built into PHP. It's called mysqli_num_rows. That's the name of the function. It takes one parameter, the result of the query you just ran. And what it's going to do is it's going to tell you how many rows were returned. So here you can see if we type in the wrong password, it returns 0 rows. If I edit this and type in the right password and run that one, you can see that it will return 1 row. 1 row. So this is what we're asking here in our code, is how many rows were returned. Was it 1 or was it 0? In this case, we're saying if the command doesn't run or if it returns 0 rows, that would all indicate that you are not a valid user. So what I'm going to do is here in my if statement, if you are not a valid user, I'm going to, I could do a couple things. I could redirect them back to the login page. That would force them to try again. I could display an error message or something. You can do whatever you want. I'm going to go ahead and move this line of code, which redirects them back to the index page. I'm just going to do that. So we're just going to copy and paste that up here instead. When you use the header to redirect the page to someplace else, I do want to point out that if you display anything on the screen first, then this redirection will not work. So if I were to up here echo out a message that said, hey, invalid username and password, and then I tried to redirect, it's not going to let them do that. And even if it did, they're not going to have time to read that message before they get sent to the other page. So just keep that in mind. If you want to display an error, then you can't do the redirection. So whichever one's more important to you. Now, before I do the redirection, I do want to make sure, since I did open a connection to the database up here, I want to make sure that I close that connection first. So to refresh your memory how to close a connection, it looks like this. mysqli_close, and you just give it the name of the connection you want to close. All right, so this is what we do if the connection fails. I'll put a comment here to remind us what this does. If they type in an invalid username or password, then we're going to close our connection and redirect them back to the login page. Well, what if they don't enter invalid information? If they enter something valid, then that means this if statement's not going to run. So we won't close the connection and we won't redirect them back to a page. So what are we going to do? In that case, we're going to we're just going to display the page that we want to see. So what I can do is, now remember, I did open a connection here. So if this line doesn't run, I want to make sure that I still close my connection. So down here, I'm still closing the connection, even if this if statement doesn't run. So I close the connection, and then what? I'm going to close my PHP block, and I'm going to open some HTML. And I'm just going to create a regular HTML page down here. Hey, I notice I've got some stuff down here already. Let's get rid of. I already have an HTML page here. Okay, so let's get rid of this. All right, so I closed my PHP block. I forgot we had this in here. So this is our handler page. We're opening up the HTML, and we're going to display a little happy face picture. All right, so just to recap, this is what's going on. If I don't close the connection and redirect you back to the login page, that means that you must be a valid user. If you're a valid user, I'll close my connection to the database since we're done with it now, and I will continue running code. And what is that code I'm going to run? I'm going to display this little message and stuff down here. You won't ever see this if you enter invalid information. And the reason why is because you'll get redirected someplace else before you have a chance to see this. There's only one other thing we want to take into account. Right here we have our if statement. If the connection is successful, we do all of this stuff. Well, what happens if the connection to the database wasn't successful? Now, again, we're not talking about if you typed in username and password properly. We're checking to see if there was a problem with the database itself. That's this login information up here. So if the connection was not successful, then I'm going to do something else. You'll recall we did the same thing for our registration handler, and all we did was we just displayed a message that said, hey, I can't connect to the database, there's something wrong, and we just used the die command. What that does is that tells the computer stop running code. So if it can't connect to the database, you're still not going to see any of this because all code stops at this point. All right, we are ready to go. Let's go ahead and test this out. We're going to type in our login information. If it is wrong, we will get redirected back to the login page again. If it is right, nothing will happen, and instead it will display this HTML information. Let's save it, and let's go to our index page. And I'm going to hit the refresh button here to make sure I'm looking at the most up-to-date version. I'm going to type in Mike, and I'm going to type in ABC123, and let's run it. All right, so here we've got an error. It says there was an unexpected brace. Oh, that is the death of all programmers, an unbalanced brace. So it says to check on line 31. Take that with a grain of salt. Let's see. Login handler. Line 31, it was right, yeah, right here. There's an unbalanced brace. See, I have a closing brace, but there's no matching opening brace. There's an open one here, close here. I open this one, I close this one. What's this one do? It doesn't have a partner. So let's go ahead and get rid of that, save it, and let's try one more. I'm going to go back and ABC123. Hey, there's the happy face. All right, so it successfully said that that was a valid password, and it displays the happy face. Let's see what happens. I'm just going to go back, and we're going to type in the wrong password. I'll just ASDF. See, we did not see the happy face. What we did see is simply it redirected us back to the login page, and we get to try again. All right, so now that we have successfully created a page that can both allow us to register for the website and log into the website using the username and password that we've registered, it's time to hack this page. We're actually going to hack our database and do all manner of nefarious things. The first type of hack we're going to do is called a code injection. Here's how it works. Okay, you know that when we log into our page, we're going to see the happy face. It's not uncommon for many websites to actually say hello and then list your name when you log in. Now, we already have that information. If I look at our table, I can see that our table stores both the username and password, but it also stores the user's first name and last name. So if we wanted, when we log in, we can display a little hello message that says, hello, Michael Wilson. Let's go ahead and tell our login page to do that. I'm going to go into the login handler. We've already established that a row exists that matches the username and password that the user has typed in. So what we're going to do is we're going to get that row and specifically access the first name and last name field. So here, when we've already pulled the entire row worth of information, so we're going to access the first name and last name fields. Here's how you do this. Since we know that a row has been returned, instead of closing the connection and returning to the login page, we're going to do something else. The way our SQL statement is set up, this can only return one row. Only one row will have the username and password information that matches. But it's not uncommon for an SQL statement to return multiple rows. So when that happens, you would use a loop to loop through all of the different rows that were returned. In this case, we know that we're only going to get one row, so we're only going to loop through one particular row here. So let's go ahead and use our loop. All right, the way this works is we're setting up a while loop, and we're using this PHP command called mysqli fetch array, and you pass it the result of your SQL command. So up here we've got our SQL command. We ran it, and the result of that, which is the entire row's worth of information, is being stored in this variable. So we're using a loop to loop through all of the records in the result. What we're going to do is we're going to display a little greeting that says, hello, and then we'll put a space, and then we want to add a little bit extra. To add to a string, or concatenate as we say in computer terms, we use the period in PHP. So I'm going to add a little extra to the word hello. In this case, I'm going to add their first name. Hello, and then I access the row, specifically the first name column. And this does have to be spelled correctly. It has to be spelled like we've spelled it in the database here, first name. This does need to be in single quotation marks, double quotation marks as well, because it is the name of the column. Okay, so what this is going to do is it's going to display our hello message and then print the user's first name. Let's go ahead and save it and test it out. I'm going to go back to our login page and log in one more time, ABC123. And right here it says hello, and it states my first name. And it got that information from the database. So this is all well and good, but what happens if I inject code into this instead of my first name? Let me demonstrate. We're going to go to the registration page, and we're going to register a new user. So here's our registration. This user will be named, the username will be Biff, and the password will be ASDF. Here, instead of typing the first name, I will type my first name. We'll say my name is Joe, but this time I'm going to add a little code to it as well. In this case, I'm going to include the HTML tag for bold. And then my last name could be whatever I want. All right, when I submit this, instead of just having my first name, I've included some code in here, and let's see what this does. Registration successful. Let's go ahead and log in now with that new account. Look what has happened. The computer has actually executed my code. Instead of just saying, hello, Joe, you'll notice that Joe is actually bold. If I inspect this, you can see that the B tags that I included in my first name are actually written as code in the inspection tool. So the browser is actually treating it like code. So what I have done here is I successfully injected my own code. In this case, it was relatively benign. It was simply a bold command, but I injected that into the web page's code. I could do something a little bit more elaborate with this as well, but it requires a little tweak to the database. Here, you may recall when we set up our database that we put a limit of 15 characters on the user's first name. That doesn't leave us a lot of room for writing code. So what I want to do is I want to go into the database, and I'm going to alter the structure of my users table. So I'm going to click on the Structure tab. And I specifically want to alter the structure of the first name column. So I'll put a checkbox next to first name, and I'm going to hit the Change button. And what I'm going to do is simply increase the length from 15 characters to 50 characters, which will give me a little bit more space for injecting some code. So I'm going to go ahead and save that chain. All right, that change is saved. I'm going to go back and I'm going to delete the user that I just created, the Joe user. We're going to recreate him again, but this time we're going to inject more than just a bold command. Let's go ahead and delete this record from the database. Okay, we'll use our registration page one more time to inject this code. So username is going to be Biff. The password will be ASDF. And our first name, this time we're going to inject something else. Let's try injecting some JavaScript. So I'm going to open up a script tag, and we'll just do display a little alert box. Hello world, and then we have to close the script tag. All right, so open a script tag, display an alert box. In this case, it's just going to say hello world, and then you must also close that script tag. And your last name can be whatever you want. All right, let's go ahead and inject this user into the database. And now when we log in, let's go back to our login page. Instead of just adding a bold, it's actually going to run JavaScript this time. Here you can see my alert box displays and says hello world. And once again, if I inspect this, I can see that this script tag has been injected into the code of the actual page. So this is called a code injection. Now you can imagine that it's one thing to display some just formatting stuff with HTML. It's quite another thing when you're actually injecting JavaScript, because JavaScript is very powerful and it could do all manner of different things. Where this really becomes a problem is if you have something like a user forum where right now, when this user logs in, they're really the only one that's going to see their little message. But if we were created a user forum where different users could post comments and then other users could reply to those comments, if it was something like that, if one of your comments was actually some JavaScript code, then every user that viewed that page, instead of seeing your comment, your code would run on their computers. And in this way, there's no telling what your JavaScript could do. So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we prevent things like this from happening. The way we can do that is through a process called sanitizing your code. To sanitize code, basically that tells the computer to look for the common characters that are used in programming and strip that stuff out or twist it around in such a way so that it's no longer recognizable as code. If you've been programming for any length of time, you know that even the slightest little mistake in a little typo, like a semicolon in the wrong place or an unbalanced brace, even the slightest little change breaks the code. So that's our goal when we sanitize, is to tweak their little commands, the little semicolons and the braces and the angle braces and things that are common to programming. We tweak that so much that it's impossible for it to run. So let's go ahead and modify our login handler so that it will sanitize this code for us. And instead of just straight up displaying whatever the user has typed in, here, whatever they've typed into the first name box, we're going to break that down a little bit. And there are some tools in PHP which allow us to do this. So one of the things we can do is this. Okay, there is a PHP function called HTML special chars, short for special characters. And what it's going to do is it's going to look for all of the special characters that are common to HTML code. In this case, the angle braces, when we typed our script command, that's a common HTML special character. And it's going to tweak those things so that they don't get displayed as actual angle braces, but instead they're equivalent. So let's go ahead and save that, and let's see what this little change has done to our page. I'm going to log in again. All right, this time you see that the alert box did not pop up. Instead, it has actually printed hello, and then it's printed what we've actually written here. You can see that script is actually displayed, but it's not part of the code itself. So what is going on? Let's go ahead and inspect this and see what is happening in the code itself. At first glance, when we inspect this, it looks like it has injected the code. You can still see the script tags right here. But if I actually go into the Sources tab, you can see that the code for this is actually quite a bit different. You can see instead of showing the angle braces, it's using the HTML special character. It's the &LT that stands for the left angle brace. And then we have the &GT, which is the right angle brace. So it's using special characters to display what appears to be an angle brace, but it doesn't actually show up that way in the code. And so since this code has been altered from its original state, the browser no longer recognizes it as code and just displays the equivalent characters. So this is an example of how you can sanitize your code using the HTML special chars command. In the next video, we will do another type of code injection. This is going to be called an Sql Code Injection. In this case, our goal is not to necessarily inject code into the page, but to inject code into the database itself. Now that will allow us to do all sorts of things. One we could ultimately display information on the page, but we could actually alter the behavior of the database itself. So we'll learn that the answer to that problem is also code sanitizing, but there are different techniques we can use when it comes to sanitizing our SQL code.